Hello everyone. How is everyone doing? I can see hellos and highs coming in already. Let's go say hi to everyone. Hi Matt, how you doing? Music's fancy, yeah, I agree. Hi Aman. Hello. I'm glad all of you could make it. While we wait for a couple of more minutes here, would anybody want to tell me how your day 3 is going? Or day 4? Yeah, we've been very fast there. How was day 4 for all of you? Tell me some of your favorite sessions that you've been attending. Let's hear from you all. Looking at the chat, making sure everything's working fine. Aman says didn't catch much of it, college and all. Oh, that's a bummer. But you were there at the very right time yesterday when we had a swag drop, and I remember you won that. Kudos to you on that. Learn JS animation. Yes, that happened today, if I'm not wrong. Interesting session there. Electronics. Yes, electronics has been a favorite session, a favorite part of series for all of you, I know. Chrome Dido. Yes, definitely. Evergreen game there. Bash scripting. That's right. Did you already get done with that? Did you have the part 3 today? Do you have more parts coming out? Another round of hellos and highs there. Learn Figma designing. Interesting. Yeah, if I'm not wrong, we've had UI, UX, Figma specifically, a lot of those design sessions this time. Busy with school and work. That's a bummer. Great listening to all of you. I think we have given a couple of minutes here. Let's get started. We'll get started. We'll have everybody in as and when they get available. But let's go. Let's get the slides on. Let's get going. So you might have already noticed from the description that we're going to talk about open source, and I really wanted this to sound fancy. So we're going to call it the open source with you session, be with you session. To introduce myself here, let me go back. There's something I need to fix. Cool. If you have not met me already, I'm Siddharth. I work here as a first party events coordinator at MLH, and my highlight again is that I have my cartoon. But I have one more highlight today, which is this is my personal best here as a streamer, because this is the third time I'm doing this. I've never done this for 3 times in a row at any Global Hack Week. Really excited to do this today. Let's summarize and see what we're going to talk about in this session. Like I've already mentioned a couple of times, we're going to look at open source through different eyes, looking at it from different perspectives. We're going to talk about what it looks like as a contributor. And I'm sure all of you have attended a lot of sessions, watched a lot of streams here and there, which talk about how it looks like to contributors. But I wanted to give you a broader perspective of what open source is, what are the different building blocks of open source, let's call it that. Also tell you what it looks like to all of the entities that are involved in open source. And then of course the best part here is we'll have a guest joining us who's going to answer all of your questions, validate some of our learnings that we're going to have today. We're going to have a lot of interesting discussion with our guest. So to begin this session, we're going to talk about how did the concept of open source evolve. So there's not much of solid evidence here. I can vouch for that, but it is believed that open source as a concept evolved much before the evolution of computers. I know this is not a very good picture to have. It's definitely not the best clarity that I could have. But let me give you a little bit of background of what you see on your screen here. So way back in the year 1895, somewhere around 1890s and early 1900s, there was a person called George B. Selden who managed to get a patent for two-cycle gasoline engine. For all of you fans of automobile, you might already know what gasoline engines are and what two-cycle gasoline engines are. But the thing that we need to understand here is this person was not a manufacturer, or in the language of patent, we call them non practicing entities, or they also call them the patent troll, which means a patent is being filed and claimed by a person who's not involved in that process. So here, George B. Sheldon had. Oh, we have fans for my MLHA profile pic. I'm sorry I get distracted by the chat, but thank you so much for that shout out to my profile picture. And I'm guessing you're referring to the cartoon. Thanks there. So George B. Sheldon managed to get a patent for a two-cycle gasoline engine, whereas there were other automobile manufacturers, real manufacturers, which did not like the idea of someone who wasn't manufacturing to have the license in their name, which was, you could have guessed it already, that which was just to make money. So they wanted everybody who was using that technology to be paying them, while they did not have any other vested interest in this. They did not really want to contribute to the development, and they did not want to really do a lot in the automobile industry. Here we bring in the next character, who's, I'm sure all of you know him. He's Henry Ford, who's the founder of Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford, along with a few other manufacturers, decided that they're done with this. They do not really want to stick to this patent setup altogether. They challenged the patent. After years of fighting for it, they were able to kind of disapprove the patent. The court gave them an order that they are free to use it, and that gave all of the automobile manufacturers a way to use it without infringing the patent. So, this is supposed to be the first instance where something that was proprietary was opened up to the larger mass to make use of it, and which actually resulted in a lot of developments in the automobile industry that you see today. Not definitely related to open source as a software, but we definitely want to believe that this is how open source, the concept of open source, the word was still not coined, but the concept of open source evolved. But I'm sure here every one of you want to know, what does open source software mean and where does that come from? Now, according to Wikipedia, the first example of free and open source software is believed to be an operating system called A2 system, a very, very old operating system developed by the UNIVAC division of a company called Remington Rand. And this, we are now at 1953. We started way back at 1859. We've come way ahead in time. We are at 1953. But the word open source was only coined somewhere around 1998, and this was at the time when Netscape was releasing their code as open source. Now, if you don't know what Netscape is, Netscape is what is responsible for the formation of Mozilla community. Mozilla, if you know, has been doing a lot of open source work. Firefox included is an open source software that was developed by them. Now we'll take a little bit of pause here, and I want your brains to tinker a little bit. Here's a question for all of you. Mozilla, the word Mozilla is a combination of two words which were actually some brands or entities or products related to Netscape. I'll give you a minute here to guess what are the two words which were combined together to come up with the word Mozilla. I will emphasize on the fact that Googling is not encouraged, but you can surely do that. Let's go. Let's see if you have answers to what were the two words that were combined to give us the word Mozilla. Looking at the chat seems to be really silent today. We have an answer here. Someone says it was mozzarella. I really like your answer, but no, that wasn't it. Let's see if we have other answers coming in. Going for a water break here. We are getting close to the answer here. We have an answer which says Godzilla and something else. Close. Mosaic Killer. I know you Googled it and you picked that up from the first search result. Not giving it to you there. Something killer, I think. FileZilla? No, it sounds similar, but no. Cheese? Not really. Cool. I think that's all the guesses we've had. Let me tell you what were the two words that combined to become Mozilla. So Netscape had released a proprietary navigator, which was essentially a web browser, which was called Mosaic. Somebody guessed Mosaic Killer there. So your first half of it was correct. And then the second word comes from the alligator mascot that Mozilla or Netscape had, I think. Netscape had an alligator mascot, which was called Godzilla. So I give the 50% of you to the 50% of correct answer to this person, and the other 50% to whoever guessed Mosaic. So Mosaic plus Godzilla gave birth to what we today know as Mozilla. Kudos to all of you for guessing that. Let's go to the next thing here. So we've talked about the history. We started way back in 1895, came down all the way to 1998. But now let's talk about what's happening in the 21st century, right where we are right now. To tell you a little bit about that, we're going to take these two reports as a reference. One of them is called the Enterprise Open Source Report by Red Hat, and the other one is the State of Open Source by GitHub. You might have known about the GitHub open source report because that's quite popular in the developer community. But you should definitely also give the other one a read, which is about how enterprises are getting involved more and more about open source. We're going to just look at a couple of points from this report. But if you're curious, I'll share these slides on our Discord server, and then you can pick that up and then look at all the links that are embedded on the slide. I have a question here. Let me bring that up. Can you share the references, resource links for contributing an open source project? We'll do that. We'll definitely get to that. But a little later, we'll set some context about open source in the world of it, and then we'll get to that. But thank you for your question. Cool. Let's just go through the points that are mentioned here. So enterprises are fastly moving towards open source. And the report says that there are at least 29% of these enterprises that have already started adopting open source software, or when they compare it with proprietary software, they see proprietary software is still winning with the majority, but there's at least 29% acceptance of open source now, which is probably the highest that we have seen right now, at least in the last 10 years. And we also see that 29% enterprises see open source as more secure, or at least as secure as proprietary software. We've had a lot of discussion take place on the security aspects of open source software. You might have heard of a lot of instances that had given open source a bad name in terms of security. But according to the report from the last year, 89% of these enterprises see they are very, very safe, or at least as safe as the proprietary software. Let's jump on to what it means to contributors and developers. GitHub says there has been 413 million contributions in 2022, which is the largest, yes. And there's over 85 million new projects that were started globally in 2022, another milestone achieved. And most interesting of all of them, 30% of Fortune 100 companies have OSPOs. I'll tell you what OSPOs are. And we can always ask our guest who's coming in next about more about OSPOs. OSPOs are open source program offices, which are, let's say, a group of people coming together to decide on the operations and structure of open source inside an organization. So let's say, and the most popular one here, I would say, is from To Do Group. You can look up To Do Group on Google and you'll get to it. To Do Group has set up a lot of guides online on GitHub where they explain how an organization can set up an open source program office for themselves and go about discussing and implementing open source practices, encouraging the developers to do a lot of more open source work inside of organizations. But yeah, I wanted to bring this up because I wanted all of you to know that this is a very safe space, has a lot of opportunities, and there is a bigger audience that's believing in it. Now, the next thing here is, again, why do you want to trust in open source? We have learned about security, but what other points does come to your mind when you think of open source? Let me do one and then I'll ask you for the next one. You might have already guessed that the world of open source has a lot of skilled people in it, which becomes a better way for enterprises or any kind of open source software to attract the best talent out there. And this is a very, how do I put this? A very non-unique way of doing this, I would say, or a unique way of doing this, I'm sorry, because we've seen hiring happen through a lot of platforms. These enterprises shelling out a lot of money to get third party to take care of their hiring. But open source has been proved to attract a lot more talent which has been very, very, very skilled. Now, I'll give you a little bit of time to tell me another point that comes to your mind of why you think open source should be trusted, while I tell you about another point here. Now, open source is all about communities. You might have seen community and open source go hand in hand wherever you might see someone talk about it, because you get the ability to start really small when you are developing an open source software, which means you don't really have to develop the software end to end. You develop it to some sense. You create a baseline, you create very, very well documented, and you don't really have to be 100% well documented software at that point, but you just set a baseline in terms of the documentation and the code that you've written, which means that this piece of code or software and the documentation that you've written should be understandable to the other folks who are going to go and contribute to your project later. Once you set a baseline, you then take up a role of a maintainer or a reviewer, let's say, and then you're just communicating with your community and making sure that your project is growing. So an advantage of having this is the ability, or advantage, or I'd say the other point that will make you trust in open source is that you're able to start small and have community of a larger audience with a lot of variety of skills come in and contribute together. Now let's talk about one more point here, and then we'll go to the next slide, which is you can share your maintenance cost. Now, what do you mean by sharing maintenance cost? While you are developing this, you are not really paying for all the resources or all the people that are working towards improving your software, which in a traditional ecosystem, let's take an example of an enterprise which is developing a software in-house and would want to do any kind of improvements to it. Now, whenever they want anybody to make improvements to it, they are paying these developers in-house to make sure that their time is compensated for and they're able to perform the best. But in an open source ecosystem, we do not really have that kind of an arrangement, and it's people coming in selflessly to contribute to a project to make it the best. Now, the best can mean anything here. The best can mean in terms of the standard of the code that's written. It can be in terms of security. It can be anything, because you are now talking to people who are spread all across the globe, and you want everybody to be coming in and contributing in whatever way they can. And to know more about the non-code contributions, we're going to have a little bit of talk on that as well. But now coming down to a little bit of activity here, can everybody go and name one open source software that comes to your mind, except for Linux, because I know all of you will come and tell me that name. But go look for an open source software and put that here on the chat. We might have a swag drop happening based on this or based on something else, so you don't want to miss that chance. Go name an open source software that comes to your mind or comes to your Google search at least. I'll give it a minute here. Let me go back and read all the chats. 85 million projects, 430 TAM. Yeah, that's huge. When the host says Discord server, where exactly on the MLH channel server is this? It's not there yet on the MLH Discord channel, but I'll post this on the Global Hack Week Lounge or on the Global Hack Week announcements channel after we are done with this. What else? Where are you sharing the slides? It's not up here. It's not up yet, but it'll be there after we are done with this session. Well, I think we have answers coming in. Ivy. That's software that I've never heard about. Let's go read more about what Ivy is. I'm hoping that was an answer to this. Oh, Unified Machine Learning Framework. Interesting. Blender, VLC, yes. Python, yes. Firefox, yes. PLC again. Chromium, yes. Stable Diffusion, really interesting project there. Apache, of course, of course. Docker, yes, 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 yes. Yes, all of you are correct. Linux, I'll give it to you there. But all of you have been doing an awesome job in researching, and I now understand that all of you know what open source means. But to break it a little more, let's go talk about the open source terminology. And these are some things that you're going to hear of, irrespective of what type of open source software you're going to talk about. Starting with a maintainer, we already mentioned maintainers a little while ago, but let me break it down for you. So whenever someone is an author of the project, they by default are a maintainer of the project, but that doesn't really mean that they're going to be the only maintainers of the project. Now, while you expand the project, while there are a lot more people coming in contributing, you have a lot more work to do as a maintainer. And then these maintainers who were originally the authors of the project, they go ahead and involve a lot more people into the community that they can trust as maintainers, who will get involved in day-to-day processes of reviewing, communicating with the audience, maybe also helping out with documentation, all of those things put together, right? So maintainer, think of them as an owner, but I would want to specify that owner here does not mean a centralized authority. Open source in itself has to be decentralized or distributed to make sure that it is not centralized or doesn't have the nature of a proprietary software. Now, who is a contributor? Contributor, I'm sure all of you already know. Anybody who contributes to the project, contributes to the growth of the project in any sense, we call them a contributor. A user can be an enterprise user or somebody who's using it locally for their personal experiments. Anybody can, both of them can be called a user here. License, this is something that you definitely should know. So license is a document which, if you're developing on GitHub, I would want to also specify here that GitHub is not only the only place that you're going to find open source projects. There are a lot more other platforms, but I'll be using these GitHub references every now and then because I think majority of you would be familiar with open source on GitHub or code on GitHub and the terms that relate to GitHub, right? So on GitHub, if you want to set up a project, you have a very simple way of maybe clicking here there a couple of times to set up a license. Now the license is a document essentially which sets forward terms and conditions of use and distribution of the software that you're going to write. We're going to talk about that a little more a little later, but just keep that in mind. Now the next in line is code of conduct. Code of conduct is a very important document that you should adopt, which defines the community standards, signals a very welcoming and inclusive project, and outlines procedure for handling any kind of abuse that happens inside your community or which relates to your project. Now I know all of you have already seen code of conduct for MLH that we always talk about, and whenever you come and participate in any of the MLH events, you are signing up and you are agreeing to the code of conduct. There's always a similar code of conduct set forward to every open source project, so it sounds very welcoming on the whole to anybody would want to get be a part of this project. I can see somebody asking if they missed anything. You did not. We are just probably a little in the future, in the sense we have covered a little bit of history of open source, but I'll send out these slides very soon so you have more idea of what this is. And we're just talking about a little bit of open source terminology now, which I am sure you might know. You can just look this up on Google as well. Very simple things, nothing complicated that we have talked about right now. Now, the last thing on this list is called README. And I'm sure all of you know what README is, but just to reiterate, README can be thought of as a shorter form of your documentation. What does that mean? You can add a README file to your repository on GitHub. Let's take that reference again. To tell other people why your project is useful, what can they do with your project, how can they help, and you basically give them pointers of what they can do, and you would want to keep it really short, and it should not become very, very lengthy because you want them to actually read through all of it and not treat it as every other terms and conditions that all of us skip very conveniently. So shorter, interactive, and insightful are the keywords that I would use for a README. Right? Let's go to the next slide here. Right, now we're going to talk about two classes of open source, or two different types of open source software that you're going to hear of: free open source and commercial open source. Now, I'd want to hear of all of your thoughts on what you think is the difference between free and commercial open source software. OSS is open source software. You might see me use that terminology, that abbreviation, more than once, multiple times during the stream. So just keep in mind, open source software is OSS here. But yeah, I'd want to hear from all of you what you think is the difference between free and commercial open source software. While you give me those answers, I'll go back and read what happened in the chat. Talking about open source, we just got started. Yes. We have enthusiastic alien jumping in to say commercial is where we should buy license to use it. I'll say you're partially correct. Yes. Do we have any other answers coming in? free open source softwares are free to use as well. Okay. Free, we can download and use it. Okay. For commercial ones, we may have to pay to use certain features. Yes. My personal experience has been that some commercial open source companies make it a pain to build it yourself. Okay. We should pay too. Okay. Cool. So I'd say all of you have given me certain parts of the answers. Let's just combine all of that together to say what free and open source or free or commercial open source would mean. So free, as all of you have rightly pointed out, it's the freedom to run the program for any purpose, study, modify, distribute. You're able to do all of that, and it's free, as the word suggests. While commercial open source project means that this can be used to raise funds of some sort, can be used for commercial purposes. Now, commercial purposes not only means that they are making it mandatory for you to purchase a license and then use it for money, but it can be as small as them selling merchandise of the project to raise some money. And this money can be, of course, to solve the sustainability problem that open source might get into, which again is a very important topic that we're going to talk about with the guest that we're going to have on. But let's just understand that everybody who is building an open source project has to be compensated for the time that they put in to do this. So they might be selling merchandise, they might be taking care of all the hosting and maintenance of the software that you're going to use. You might have to pay for that. Again, like all of you mentioned, they might make it mandatory for you to purchase a license for you to use it. And there's also another way of doing this, which is called an open core model. This is something that I want to touch very briefly, and I leave it up to all of your curiosity to go learn more about it and just some companies that use it. But let's just understand what open core means. Now, open core essentially means that there are probably multiple versions of the software that are made available. The versions can be named anything, but for simplicity, let's just understand the first version is called the community version or a limited community version, and the other is called the enterprise version. Now, the limited community version is where you can use everything for free. You can go and contribute. You can actually do anything that you can do with a free software, use it for free as well. But the other side of things, which is the enterprise version that's made available, as the name suggests, is for enterprises to pay for it and then use for it. Now, this ensures that everybody in the open source ecosystem who just wants to use this, experiment this, and maintain the true nature of open source is able to use this without any trouble through the community version. Whereas the enterprises that are going to use this are paying for the time that developers have put in to make this project through probably buying a license and paying for the license or paying for a subscription model, let's say. Any one of those can work here, right? I see enthusiastic alien talking about sustainability problem. Yeah, we're going to very quickly talk about that a little bit more. Hold on for a little bit more. We have a guest joining us who's going to tell us more about that. Right? If you're all here, give me a thumbs up to tell me that you've now understood what free and commercial open source are, or you probably had a revision of all the knowledge that you already had. Give me a thumbs up. Let me know that we're good to proceed. While we do that, let me go back and read everything in the chat. Somebody says commercial open source used for a company to make money. Yeah, kind of. Commercial one is user cannot really edit. Yeah, we just proved some part of that wrong. Cool. I see some thumbs up pouring in, which means all of you can hear and see me very well, and you are with me on all of this. Let's go to the next slide here. This is something that I don't feel is widely discussed uh, in the open source ecosystem, because every now and then we just give out questions on the lines of how do I get started with contribution, and we're just constricting ourselves to the contributor side of things. But I want all of you to know what it takes to be an open source maintainer. I would also encourage all of you to look at that side of it through the stream that we're doing right now. And an important part of doing that is to know the legal side of open source. Yes, that exists. Not everybody was aware of it, I'm sure. But let's just go and look at what that means. I've broken that down into 3 points that I thought I should be discussing here, starting with why should we talk about the legal side of open source project. Now, when we discussed about licenses, you might remember that I told you that these licenses are terms and conditions that you set forward, which defines what people can do and probably also shouldn't do with your project. Now, you can actually set forward a term or a condition that says you can use it however you want to, but you can never claim copyright over any kind of modification that you're going to do over a software. So you might want to set up a lot of these terms here and let them know that they should be doing X, Y, and Z, and they should not be doing A, B, and C. That's one side of it. Now, the second is you as a user of it, or you as someone who's probably using an open source project, a piece of an open source project to build another piece of an open source project, a completely different one that you had an idea of. You might want to always go back and check what dependencies you are using and what license requirements do these open source projects or dependencies that you're using have in them, to make sure you are doing everything that's legally allowed by these project authors or maintainers. Make sense? Now, the second point here is, and I would want all of you to know this, and I probably did not also know before I started preparing for this session, which is a public GitHub project, not equal to a very developer way of saying that, but a public GitHub project is not always a licensed project. Now, what does that mean? Like I told you, if you're on GitHub while you're creating a project, you have a very simple way of choosing a license. We'll talk about what type of licenses exist. But you have a very easy process of setting the terms of what and why people should be interacting and how people should be interacting with your project. But while you're creating it, you might have seen while you're on GitHub, you have two options to select from. You can make it a private repository, or you can make it a public repository. Now, a public repository can exist without a license. And if you're playing by the rules, someone or you cannot really legally use any part of a GitHub public repository in your code, even if it's public, unless you have been given explicit permission and the right to do so. Which means we've all been used to picking up pieces of code from here and there, even if we do not see a license associated to it. But according to the rules, you should probably be asking them, getting permission from them, and only then asking this. Now, an easy way for you to give permission to a broader mass of audience without them getting in touch with you, uh, personally, one-on-one, you should probably have a license which mentions, hey, this is what you should be doing with the software, and this is what you should not be doing with the software, right? Now, the last point here is licenses. We've talked a lot about it, but let's get reintroduced to what licenses are. Now, we told you that licenses are terms and conditions that you're going to set. And if you're wondering what do you do with licenses, or how do you create licenses, do I really need to write every line of the license that I'm going to create? The answer is no. You already have a lot of licenses that have been created by a lot of people inside of the open source ecosystem. They already have it ready for you, and GitHub has done a very good job of keeping all of that as a single click feature, wherein you just click on the license that you want to adopt, and that gets automatically added to your project. Now, if you are confused on which one to start, you should definitely go and read about all the ones before you select on one of them, because once you select on one of them, you have contributors coming in. It's very difficult to now change the license, and you have a process to follow to do that. But if you're really confused, you don't really know which one to select, I would say you can never go wrong with the MIT license. Select that, build your project, and then once you have more and more people joining in a private ecosystem, essentially, if you have a private group of contributors or maintainers who are going to help you decide on things, you can always ask them and then change and then make it completely public for anybody else to come and contribute, right? Let me go back into the chat and see if we have questions. Open source necessary to use. Is it necessary to use license? By the definition of it, a valid open source project is one that has a license in it. But if you are just using it for a personal purpose, if you had a how do I put this? If you have a fun project that you're working on, and you want some people in your circle to contribute, some of your friends to contribute, it's probably going to be a project from school that you're building. You don't really need a license to be able to do that. But if you are actually building a valid open source project, which is probably going to have a lot of people contributing to, you might want to use licenses. That's the best practice to go about it. Cool. I think that's all we have here. Easy peasy. Let's go talk about some metrics now. Now, the next thing here is to know what are open source metrics and why are they required, and what are some metrics that you should be looking at. Now, understand why metrics are important. And I'd also want all of you to guess, why do you think you should have a lot of metrics for open source projects? Now, let me give you an example of what I mean by metrics. While you do, let's say you made a website today and you integrate Google Analytics to your website to know who's joining who's joining in on your website, where are you getting most views from, what is the age group, and all of those things that Google Analytics makes available to you, right? Now, which ones do you think is important for open source projects here? Help me list it down on the chat. But I'll get started with a little bit and then I'll refer to the chat once you start giving me those answers. So the first thing is, of course, to know what your users are responding to in both the ways. Now, a response could mean a negative response where they're probably using it and not liking it, which is a red flag for you and you have to rectify it. If you don't have metrics that can define these responses, you're never going to figure out what your users are feeling about it. And if they're feeling very good about it, you should definitely go back and ask them how to improve it, right? Now, the second one is to figure out where your users and your community members are coming from. Because let's say these are the users that you're going to interact with more to improve your project, and there might be some sort of an enterprise signal also in there. Let's say you are a maintainer, or you are a group of maintainers that has aims to make this a commercial open source project later on, and you're actively looking for some signals that can convert into an enterprise user for you later. If you don't have any clue of what users are coming in, where they're coming in from, what are their backgrounds, you're never going to figure that out, right? So you need a way to figure out who's joining you as a user, as a contributor, or whatever you'd want to measure that way. Now, you also need to quantify your project's popularity. I am sure all of you know about GitHub Stars. GitHub Stars right now has been, I probably think, the most popular, wherein everybody thinks more number of GitHub Stars would mean the project is more popular. But popularity, I think, is a subjective term. For you, popularity can mean the number of stars, number of eyes, or the number of people that have saved it for later or bookmarked it. But popularity can also mean the number of users it has. Uh, if it's a commercial open source project, the number of people that are paying for it. If it's a normal open source project, you can also quantify it by the number of contributors you have. So uh, the number of stars is always not the best metric that you need to follow, but it gives out a lot of idea of probably the initial set of popularity that your project is gaining. I hope you understand what that means. Now, again, money is not always related to enterprise users paying for it. You might be able to also find sponsors for your open source project, because free open source project, or developers that develop free open source projects, really, really, really want money to be able to feed themselves. Stars cannot do that for them. So these analytics or these metrics would also help them get an idea of who's probably interested in sponsoring them and is probably looking for a way to sponsor them, right? GitHub sponsors is already there. You have a very easy way of sponsoring people now. But yeah, you need to actually get an idea of who and where. So some metrics that we talked about are stars, number of contributors, number of pull requests is also a good way to know how many people are interested in improving your project. You should also probably internally have a statistics of the number of issues that were opened in a month to the number of issues that were closed in a month. That actually means that there are people out there who would want to solve problems very quickly whenever somebody raises it. That's also a very good indicator of a very good and active project or a community. Now, sponsorship metrics, at last, we already talked about that. You need money to be able to survive. Right. Before we get into the last section, which is a little bit of contributions, we will go now talk about incentives. We talked about sponsorship a couple of times, which is, and these incentives are both for maintainers and contributors. Now, whenever you do something, you'd want people to sponsor you for survival, for appreciation as well. So sponsorship, where do you find them? The easiest is GitHub sponsors. You have a very easy way of thanking the maintainers or the developers of it by sponsoring their work directly, and you should probably do it if you can afford it. And there are also very popular other platforms, not going to name any one of them particularly, but there are platforms that have set up a way to sponsor work outside of GitHub as well. Now, funds can be broadly of two types. You can get funds from your enterprise users, which can be through the fees they pay for license, the fees they pay for, let's say they are not really paying for use, but they are using your free software and they just want to give it to you as sponsorship, but they call it a fund while they're giving out to you. So just understand this as anything that comes from enterprise users. You can classify that as one section of the fund, but the other is through nomination. Now, this is an interesting aspect here. You might have noticed a lot of these very big companies. I remember, I think the very popular one that we heard last doing it was Spotify. We also heard Appright doing that, wherein they have an open source funding program altogether where you and me as normal people can go and nominate projects from the list of projects that we love. And then they have as a parameter of selecting some popular ones from there, some active ones from there, and they fund the the maintainers of the project for the work that they are doing, which is a very, very, very good way for these maintainers and developers to survive. Grants again are, let me give you an example of GitHub grants. This will be very relatable to all of you, especially if you're in India. You might have seen GitHub grants being given out to open source developers. uh, I don't really know the exact number of grants that they give out and the exact number of the exact amount. I'm not really sure of both of them, but I know for a fact that there are at least 10 people, I think, every year that have who are provided GitHub grants only and only for the open source work that they do. There's always a parameter that they set out, and there are other benefits also that you get if you're an open source developer, and if you're above a certain criteria. There is always a certain bit of discount that's given for you for the various products available on GitHub, or they make it completely free for you. There are things like that that happen. So it doesn't mean that if you're an open source developer full time, or if you are an open source contributor, it doesn't mean that you're always doing it for free. The idea of open source is for you to develop things and provide things selflessly. But as I remember from one of the Twitter spaces that I was part of, where we were talking about open source, somebody mentioned FOSS is not always just free open source, but it also has to be fair open source. And the concept of fair open source comes in here, where you have to make sure it's fair for everybody who builds it and who uses it, both sides of the world, right? Now we are jumping straight into the last section before we invite our guest onto the stage. This is where I want to talk about non-code contribution. Now, I know this might be a disappointment for all of you. You might be waiting for a lot of code contribution opportunities. You might have been waiting to hear of code contribution, but we'll do that. We'll do that briefly once we have our guest over. But I want to specifically touch on non-code contributions because this is something we have not talked about a lot at a lot of forums, and there is way more than you can always imagine in this field. Now, to talk to you about, okay, I already see some folks jumping into the chat to say what non-code could mean. Documentation fixes, absolutely. You want to do design contribution? Yes, that's also one way of doing that. Let me introduce you to way more than all of those, all of the two things that you could identify. To do that, I'm actually going to use a blog by someone called Navendu. Navendu is someone that I know personally. He's also working for an open source project as a developer evangelist, developer advocate, and he's very well written, and probably the best blog that I have seen out there, which explains how you can contribute through non-code. Let's use that as a reference and quickly look at the different types of things that you can do to make those contributions. Let me reshare my screen to get that up. Cool, we have this now. So this is Navendu's blog. I'll drop the link if anybody wants to refer, but this is not just the only thing that you're going to find out there, but I just wanted to use this as a reference while we're talking about it. So these are the list of things that we're going to do. We're going to very quickly talk about everything. So I give you a very baseline idea of what all of this means, right? So starting with writing, the section is called writing, wherein documentation, somebody already guessed that, documentation fixes, adding to the documentation, making the documentation very beginner friendly is a perfect way to get started. If you don't understand a lot about writing code, you can go ahead, use it for yourself, understand some things, follow the documentation while you're setting things up, and help identify issues in the documentation, fix it on your own if you can, or ask somebody else to fix it, right? The second is articles and tutorials. Before we get there, I have some people asking for the link. Yes, I will drop the link here. I am sorry I forgot to do that. Let me drop the link on the chat. Cool. This is the link here. Yeah. You should have it in the chat. Yes, it's out there. Now, next is articles and tutorials. You might have seen a lot of people writing blogs or any kind of tutorials which might not be directly associated with the project. You're probably writing it based on your experience of using it. You should always do that, because not only gives the project a lot of visibility, it also is helping you improve your writing skills. And I'm sure you might have now realized, or you might have heard a lot of people say how important it is for you to also develop your writing skills, be able to communicate it as a developer. And the world of content writing, technical content writing specifically, is huge and has a lot of opportunities for you waiting out there. The next in the writing section is internalization, which is a very difficult word to pronounce. And then there is translation. Now, a very easy way to explain this is, you might have noticed that most of the documentation for a particular piece of software is in English, but that doesn't guarantee that the audience for it is English speaking or has English as their native language. Now, I personally know of a lot of open source projects that have been looking for help in terms of translation of the documentation into other regional languages or other international languages. You might see the most common languages that we have had is Chinese or English, because we have a lot more people talking about that, or talking in that language, speaking or communicating in that language. But there are other languages that always need support. Now, I personally have known a project which was looking for folks to translate it into Spanish or lesser popular languages such as Hindi. Even Hindi, I know a project that was looking for folks to translate that, because over the time they realized that their audience is not English speaking audience. They want people to be able to use it, and the only way to ensure that people are able to use it is by translating their documentation. So that's another thing that you should be looking forward to. If you ask me where to find these opportunities, you might find that on GitHub if the project is on GitHub, or you just have to go to a project community. They might exist on Slack, Discord, Discourse. They use a variety of platforms that way. Go talk to them, tell them what your skills are, and they will be very, very happy to help you find a way to help them, right? The next is social media. All of us are very active on social media. Whenever you come across an interesting project, give them a shout out, give them probably also a GitHub star if you think that helps them. Go ahead, spread the word about their project. Just a normal Twitter post, or let's say a LinkedIn post where you say, hey, I use this, I built this. Shout out to the maintainers who built a very good project. And that is a word of appreciation that you're passing to them, right? Okay, I have a question here relating to translation. What does translation mean? Translating the code or only translating the documentation, right? Not really translating the code. I think by translating the code, you mean a shift of programming language. That's probably not something that you will find very commonly happening. Translating documentation, yes. Here we are specifically talking about non-code. So we're talking about the project maintainers looking for you to help them translate their documentation, which might be originally in English, into another language where they feel, or which they feel consist of majority of their audience, right? I hope that clarifies it. Cool. Let's get into designing. That's another popular thing that we heard in the chat. Designing, again, you can develop artwork for them, which can be a logo for the project, which can be UI for the website. And if one day they decide to have their own merchandise, you can also go ahead and help them design their merchandise. Another interesting thing to do. Style guides. This is again a very important thing, which wherein you might have noticed that on GitHub we take multiple steps to go ahead and say, hey, this is a format or this is a standard of code that you should be maintaining while you're trying to contribute to a particular project. But you might not find this the similar thing happening for design. But design is also something that's very different based on our cultures or where we come from. So having a design style guide or a design standard set for a particular project is also very important. If you're a designer, you already know what I'm talking about. You can go to the project and ask them if they're open to designers contributing, and if they are, they definitely need a set of standards that have to be mentioned before anybody can go ahead and contribute. Check that out. Coming down to testing, these are probably very easy to understand. Reporting bugs while you're using it, you will come across bugs. Also, volunteer to fix it if you can, but that's on the code side of things. Advocating, talk about open source projects, like what we're doing here. We're spreading the word of open source. Do that whenever you can. Doesn't really have to be on screens. Whenever you go to a meetup, you find a project being appropriate in that ecosystem, talk about that, spread the word. User experience, UX and UI is particularly not something that open source is very good with, because it's mostly majorly always a developer centric world. So designers are really valued there. Help them improve their user experience. Alpha beta testing, if there are projects which are open to having alpha beta testers to improve their project, if you think you can help them out, go sign up for it. Community management is the next thing that we're going to talk about. Community management is a very popular thing that you might have heard of, wherein you can become a project organizer. You can become a normal community manager by just going and telling them that you would want to talk to people, help them with their issues and all of those things. Like all of you out here in the chat and on MLH community Discord, you go ahead and help new members of MLH navigate through Discord or navigate through everything that we try and do. Shout out to all of you for doing that. You can do the similar thing by going to an open source project and helping them out do that. And trust me when I say this, it's very difficult to wear a maintainer's hat. They have so many things to keep track of, so many different platforms to keep track of, so many metrics to look at. If you can help them in any small way, they'll be very interested in having you help them. Go check it out. Project organizer is someone who probably is looking at some things that might be going wrong with the project. Let's say there are a lot of issues that have been labeled, but they have not been, let's say there have been a lot of issues that have been raised but not labeled. Now these issues need to be labeled to be able to identify this issue. Basically, let's talk about it like this. Now we can have probably three issues. Let's imagine there are three issues coming in. Now, without a label on it, we don't really know if the issue, let's say, is from the documentation side or the front end side or the back end side. Now, the project maintainer always has a list of labels that they set, so it's easier for them to understand what a particular issue is talking about, right? Or what problem they are referring to. If you become a project organizer, you can probably help them identify and label these issues correctly, which will help them a lot. But to do this, you might need a certain level of experience with the project. So this is not something you can probably get started with, but that is something that you can get to eventually. Release manager is also something that you can get to eventually, wherein when project is trying to do a release, you might want to get a lot of things together, get the team together, do some checks, and that's something, but it's a little complicated. We'll not talk a lot about that. Event organizer is again a very good thing that you can do. Open source, because it's about community building, and the key to community building is to be able to define a very strong communication channel between your users and the maintainers. Now to do that, you can go ahead and organize these kinds of events where you're probably getting a maintainer to talk about the changes that they're trying to do. You can also get some contributors, give them a spotlight, have them talk about what they've been contributing, get some enterprise users talk, let them talk about what they're doing, right? Make it interactive. So that's what event organizers will do. Last but not the least, if you are someone who's gained a little bit more of experience from a project, you can go ahead and mentor people. Mentoring can mean you help them with code review. You're not writing code, you're reviewing code, making sure it's up to the standards, making sure it's very good. You do that. And then you can also help newcomers, similar to what I just mentioned. Help newcomers navigate their way through a Discord or Slack, navigate their way through documentation. You can always do all of that, right? So this was a very good resource that I found online and I wanted to present to all of you. We are now going to go back to the slide and talk about what we have next. Cool. Next up is the best part, where we're going to invite a guest over. We're going to invite this guest, and please make sure that you have all of your questions in the chat. So we're going to make this very interesting and very communicative. I have a couple of questions that were asked earlier, which I kept it for the end. One of them was about the sustainability problem, which somebody had on the chat. We're going to talk about that. There's someone else who asked about some documentation to get started with open source, I believe. We're also going to ask that with a lot of other things. So, our guest for today is Joshua Poduku, who works as a lead developer evangelist for Apache DevLake, who's also a very dear friend of mine, and he's been in the world of open source for a very, very, very long time. Let me get him on the stage now. Hi, Joshua, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, all good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How about you? I was listening to the session. It was really great.
Yes, I'm glad you spent a lot of time here listening to it. We've all been very excited to have you on stage. Do you want to maybe begin by telling people a little bit about yourself and what you do right now?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I think this is second engagement with MLH in a row. So last month I had a podcast with your founder.
Hmm.
So yeah, so basically, I'm currently working as a lead developer evangelist for Merico, and we have an open source project called Apache DevLake, which is part of us. And you know, I've been working as a DevRel for almost 2 years now, and been in the community space since my college, and that's how it ignited my interest towards open source community building and um, developer relations in general. And throughout my journey, this is the best tool I can say, which helped me throughout and helped me to evolve who I am and get the best out of me, get the best out of the community which I helped and contributed. So it has a huge role to play, of course. And I met some amazing people like Siddharth throughout the journey, and that's the best part. Always that you meet new people, you get to learn. Always, every day, you get to learn something. And I also help to I also like to help uh, and mentor people who want to get started with open source. So I have some small initiatives and one-on-one mentorship sessions, public speaking, and streaming like this. That's what I'm doing currently, right? And yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you so much for that, Joshua. And I can really vouch for the fact that open source has helped a lot of people grow in a lot of sense. And it's probably the easiest way for you to get in touch with people all across the globe because open source knows no boundary. You're able to expand in whatever horizon you want to. And it's also a place where you can experiment with a lot of skills that you have. You don't really need to be a developer and stick to being a developer for all your life. You can go ahead and talk to people, explore anything and everything that open source involves. Really, really good. Now, I would want to begin with probably something that we've not talked about, which is on your title we see, or on your project's name we see, it says Apache DevLake. We've seen a lot of other projects which have Apache as the prefix and then the project name as the suffix. Why is that and how is that? What does that mean?
Okay. So this is frequently asked question by most of them in the community. Like,
Mhm.
there are two things which people often get confused. One is Apache software and another one is Apache Foundation. So these are two different things, run by Apache, the central entity. So Apache Foundation is helping the projects to sustain and work, you know basically forming operations over the project, and incubating the project, and also uh, getting it gives us a lot of support with Apache mentorships, where maintainers get the mentorship from the Apache board members, and stuff like that. So so whatever project is associated. So DevLake was an independent project. We applied into the Apache Incubator program. So once you are selected, I think there were 5,000 projects who applied, and we were one among 500 or something. So only 10% of projects were, approved. Um, so whoever gets approved, so they have to follow some nomenclature, like wherever you want to mention, you need to mention Apache as a prefix and then your actual project name as a suffix. So that's how
Mhm.
it works.
So can we imagine this as an incubation program for open source projects?
So that is just one part of it. So Apache incubator program is something which you need to pass to
Mhm.
be an official Apache project, right?
Okay.
So that is stage one of any project who wants to get into the ecosystem of Apache. And
Mhm.
once you get into that, you're officially an Apache project. But we are still an incubation project right now. But I think we are still evaluating, and hopefully, we are all good to get through the incubator program and be onboarded as official Apache project.
Nice, interesting. You talked about how open source has helped you to achieve a lot of things that you've achieved in your life, right? But I know that you've also worked with organizations which have not been open source by nature of their existence. Is there anything that you notice as a difference between organizations that build open source projects are open source natured, uh, in general, and the other ones?
So, so let me bring open source into a cultural aspect than a software right now, because when it comes to organizations, open source is something which is most adopted in dev tools, right? In developer tools, but if we come to the cultural aspect of open source, there are lots of differences. Number one is I have seen the companies which adopt and promote open source are most likely to create better culture,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of trust naturally created through the whole operations and whatever the activities that happen in the open source centric companies.
Mhm.
And where the companies are not really open source, take a lot of time to build the community vibe, to build that trust, freedom of sharing anything, that culture which actually is more friendly than what it is than a corporate culture. You get a lot of learning opportunity, I can say that's number one. And there's no one who can actually oppose you and say you're wrong, and you should not do that. People allow to make mistakes and learn through the mistakes in open source kind of models.
Mhm.
So yeah, these are the key things, but it's not that you should adopt open source just for the sake of open source, but you should understand the culture, and if that syncs with your philosophy and your thinking, then it's all good to go.
Thank you for that. And I completely missed folks that were saying hi and good evening to you. So I'll just bring them up so you can see them.
Yeah. Hi
Thank
everyone,
you.
it's good to be here.
Yes. So you emphasize on the importance of a community, and that being a very big role in the success of an open source project or an open source enterprise project, any one of those, right? And this
Yeah.
reminds me of what Avi from Scarf had mentioned once, which was your community is a lot more than just the people that send you code, which is exactly true,
Yeah.
right? It's not about just people that are sending you code. They're not the people that are in your community. It definitely involves your users too, but there are a lot more people that are advocating for you, that are writing for you, that you probably are never able to track, right? Now we did mention talk about a little bit earlier in the session about the metrics that we would want to take into consideration as an open source project and understand the growth of projects. We talked about GitHub stars as one way to do it. We talked about number of contributors that are joining, the issues that get raised, and all of those things, right? But from your experience, I'd want to know or probably also validate the facts that we just learned? Is it actually just necessary to only look at GitHub stars as a way of your growth, or are there other things that you personally or your project looks at?
So basically, let me come back to the statement which you mentioned. Is community really important for the project to grow? And uh, other than code, right? People who contribute as a non-code contribution. Yes, of course, because the community uh, makes it uh, a positive environment for anyone who sees at the first place. It adds more human touch to what's happening in the software, right? So what's happening in the developer community. So community is more like there is someone who I can rely on, that kind of a feeling, and there's someone who can help me, that kind of a positive feeling which community actually creates. And it's not only that creates that environment, but it is actually working in that way, right? Anyone who joins into the community, there are people who don't really code, but who work completely on understanding uh, you know the contributor, the understanding the users, make uh, communication much easier for anyone who is just joining in. So there are lots of things which you need to look at when you think about an open source project. And one of the best ways and the best mechanisms, which is of course successful, is the community centric approach. And I forgot the next question you were asking. Can you please repeat that?
No, I just wanted to kind of help everyone validate that it's not just about GitHub stars always, and that's not just one way of, that's not just the only way of, validating that your project is growing and there's considerable popularity for your project. And do you think there are other ways that you're using right now for your project to make that or take that into account?
Yeah, sure. So even our project itself is based on helping uh, anybody to create quality metrics. So by quality metrics, we mean it's not just about stars, it's about how many people are starting the project on a monthly basis. Like if
Mhm.
if you're releasing an interesting feature and you see the stars, and if you're not releasing an interesting features and you are just seeing the stars all of a sudden, so there's a difference, right? And that's not just about stars. We also look at the contributor activity, like how many contributors are actually doing something for the project on a weekly basis. What's the frequency of people getting involved on a monthly basis, on a period of time? So
Mhm.
these are the things that actually helps you to maintain the community health. So if you can go to Apache DevLake documentation, there's a use cases section within the website, so you can see the community dashboard there. So that community dashboards help you to determine, or rather, um, you know, uh, get so many metrics together and define a meaningful metric, right? Like, you cannot rely on single metric like stars, but you can add
Mhm.
some more dependencies to it to make into a quality metric rather than a quantity metric. I think that's more important than just judging any project on based on the number.
Right. The key takeaways here would be one, it's always quality over quantity. Very well put there. And also to understand what community health means here. And community health is never really directly related to the popularity of the project. You might see your stars raising, but you never really know how your community is feeling about whatever you're doing, or do they really feel that this is an inclusive or welcoming space for them. Very well said. I think we have a question here. Let me bring that up. Yes. Are you able to read this question on your screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go. So the question is open source limited to any age group, or anyone with a sound knowledge who passes all the ticks for contributing can contribute? I'd want to add another question here, which is there a list of checks for you to contribute as they mention?
So I honestly don't think there's a standard list of checks. You know, open source is as simple as if you have any skill, you can just put it in any project.
Mhm.
Like, you know, just one example. I know we are going to talk about this later, but there's a person who actually started as a travel desk manager for an open source conference, right? Who was just sitting there and just helping the attendees to get their amenities, get their rooms in the hotels and navigation directions, etc., in
Mhm.
an open source conference. And now she is a board member of Apache Foundation, right?
Wow.
So, so she, I think she has a started her journey in 2000 or 1998 or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, as a travel manager, and now she's the board member for Apache projects. So it's not that you need to know. There's no barrier in open source. Number one, and then anybody can contribute to open source, but just you need to understand the culture. Like, you need not be a skill conscious when you are entering into open source. You need to be conscious of the culture and what you are going to put in, right? And how you're going to help others to grow. So it can be anyway. And of course, as you mature in the open source ecosystem, there's always something you need to learn. You need to, of course, pass some, ticks for contributions. Like, suppose if you are interested to help a project, then you might be learning a new language if you are contributing to the code side of things. If you want to advocate for the projects, then you need to apply in different conferences and maybe try it out and talk to your maintainer that this is what I'm going to speak. So will this help your project? Take some feedback. So it depends on how you're going to contribute. So of course there are always some ticks you need to pass. But to start with, you don't need anything to actually um, learn, or there's no barrier basically to contribute to open source.
Right, really inspiring story there, and I'm sure both of us have another person in mind while we're talking about inspirations for open source, which is not taking any names here, but there's another popular open source maintainer who started their journey as a soldier in the U.S. Army, if I'm not wrong, and they were in Afghanistan, deployed in Afghanistan, where they started writing code whenever they could, and that's now evolved as a very popular open source project. It's doing very very well there. So it doesn't really matter what walk of life you're coming in from. If you kind of relate with the vibe that open source communities give you, you definitely should go in and give it a try. Just give it a try and then decide if you'd want to stick on. As simple as that. But now talking about a little bit of let's take this question then. We have it waiting here, which is, can you tell us about very first and almost most contribute interesting open source project for contribution? I think they're asking you about some very easy ways to get started with open source contributions, and probably also some places they can find good first issues. Essentially, would you want to take this question now?
Yeah, I think that's very easy to find nowadays because GitHub has a lot of features where you can put some filter and browse through any category of projects.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you want to, choose a dev tool, you can go through the dev tool tag in GitHub and you can just have a look at it. And if you
Mm-hmm.
want to go through language, uh, search through language, and you can search, lots of projects.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the first thing you can do is go through the documentation of a project. Once you know get into the website of the project, or you find it on GitHub, go through the documentation. And there's always something missing in the documentation because the maintainers and the key contributors of the project don't really think from a beginner perspective, and they always think on a deeper level, and they think you know whatever is good for them, it's good for others, but certainly it's not. So, and they are always working hard to you know make the community more inclusive, and that's one aspect where you can contribute. Like anything you find that can be fixed or made better for beginners, you can just open a pull request, open an issue, and submit a PR if you can. If you don't know how to submit a PR, go to their Discord or Slack or wherever the project community is, ask
Mhm.
questions. They would definitely help you, right? I think that's the first contribution you can do as a beginner.
Makes sense. There's also the same question again. We've answered that already. But I think we can now go back and talk about the sustainability problem. That's something that I mentioned while we were streaming earlier. And we also had somebody else ask us what the sustainability problem mean. Do you want to shed some light on what sustainability is and what is the probable sustainability issue or problem that exists in this world?
Sure. So basically, it's a controversial topic, the sustainability aspect is. But I would like to shed a light because um, I think you mentioned about commercial open source, right? And commercial open source operates in open core model, right? Where
Mhm.
some of the project uh, features are open sourced, and the high level features, which are usually expensive or used by large scale companies, are in the premium version of that same software.
Mhm.
So even our company works that way right now.
Mhm.
So if open core model is adopted, it can solve the sustainability issue of what they are facing. But some people believe that sustainability is not a problem; it's just created out of nowhere.
Mhm.
But I think there are two ways to look at it. But if we look at this, uh, how to solve the sustainability problem, I think it's way more easier now than it was in 1990s. Um, and I think the legacy projects usually complain that they are having these issues
Mhm.
because they are just working on the legacy code and not making it beginner friendly. I guess that's number one. And because of that, as time passes, they are losing contributors, and the people who contributed either might have retired, or they are not working anymore. So that's number one. And then because of this, they don't get enough funding and don't get enough awareness of the project, and so on, the list goes on. But if
Mhm.
you implement an open core model, the money comes in from the other side, so you can feed your contributors, feed your community monetarily, and you can survive as a company, and you can onboard new contributors, you can create more programs like MLS does, um, and other companies does. So there's always something coming in and something going out, right? So I think that's where it can be solved, and that's how it can be addressed in open source. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And because you mentioned about MLH, just taking a minute here to talk about the fellowship program that we have, wherein the fellows that get selected do contribute to open source projects and the popular ones. And that's under the software engineering track that we have. If you're interested, you can go straight to this website. I'll drop it here. Check out what fellowship is and go ahead and contribute. While I'm dropping that in the chat, looking for more questions, feel free to ask questions. We have a little bit more time before we would need to wrap it up. Waiting for your questions there, but till they have questions coming in, I know developer evangelism, developer advocacy, they've all been very popular in this ecosystem. When I say ecosystem, it's not just open source, but it's been the hype for some time. Uh, there are two questions here. One, what you really do as a developer advocate or developer evangelist, both at your place of work and in general, what is this role about? And I am sure people know why they should be getting into this role. But let me put you on the spot here to tell us, who do you think is a good developer advocate and what are the skills required to become a good developer advocate?
Sure. So it's again a broad question to address. I don't think the time would be enough,
Uh-huh.
but I would just give a gist of what exactly DevRel is, right?
Mhm.
So DevRel is um, there are lots of blogs you can read by people in the space, but DevRel is firstly a mindset, not a role, not a not a job description, or it's not a task, or it's not something which you can just define in one sentence. It's more like a mindset. um,
Mhm.
and yeah, DevRel is basically developer relations, developer evangelism,
Mhm.
and developer advocacy. That all different things, but lots of similarities. For example, developer evangelist focuses more on um, building the evangelism part of DevRel. They're expanding uh, on the evangelism side where awareness is more needed. For example, awareness is already there, but you need to work on the core developer uh, APIs or anything like that. So then developer advocacy comes into the picture, right? So where
Mhm.
you advocate the developers, you have evangelized, but you need to advocate now, right?
Mhm.
You have created awareness, but they are all into your community and into your ecosystem. Now what's next? Then you need to work on the technicalities. So there are always different focuses of this role, and
Mhm.
who can actually get into this role. um, if you have a mindset to help people, and you can speak about any topic confidently, you can grasp anything within limited period of time. If you have good communication skills, and um, you know you can connect with people very well, and you are a good listener. That's number one. Empathy is the number one skill for DevRel. If you are not empathetical, then you cannot give the solution to the other person, right? So
Mhm.
these are some of the things um, you can just relate to the answer. But there is a good website called What is DevRel. So you can go check that out to know more about DevRel. I think it's created by developer advocate of Vercel, if I'm not wrong. So you can just check that out. Yeah.
Cool. Is it whatisdevil.com?
Yes.
Cool. I'll drop that in the chat. Sweet. Yeah, I think we have one last question here, which might be repetitive, but if you'd want to, in very brief, answer that, the stage is yours.
So again, there are certain tags in the GitHub itself, because GitHub being the storehouse of open source project, I'm just telling GitHub. It's nothing to do with my endorsement or anything like that. So there is a tag called good first issue, and there's also called first timers tag, if I'm not wrong. But good first issues are more popular. And there's also a tag called beginner and beginner friendly. So you can search all these four tags, and definitely you'll find something very interesting and something good to contribute as a beginner.
Nice. I think that's all the questions we have. One last scroll to make sure we answered everything. Yes, looks like we have done everything. Thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us today. But before I let you go, I'm going to make you do one last job here, which is we have a tradition of doing swag drops, and we have
Okay.
our guests do swag drops. So let me give you a little bit of idea of how swag drop works, and then you can decide how you'd want to do this. So you can either pick up someone from the audience who was really active asking you questions, a question that you liked, and they be eligible for swag drop, or you can ask them some question, have them answer. It can be a fastest finger first kind of a thing, or you pick up one answer from it randomly. But yeah, anything like that. Ask them a question, whichever answer you like. Whoever answered that gets the swag. Any ideas in your mind?
That's really tricky, but I'll try to do that, because if I'm picking someone, it should be only one, right?
Yes, one person.
There are lots of people who are active, but I think there's someone who is
Mhm.
pretty new. He came in between, I guess. I think um, Shellstronic or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Spelling the right uh, word.
This person?
Yeah, yeah. This person. Maybe he can get the swag staying active.
Congratulations.
I think one of his questions too that caught my attention, but we answered in the later phases of the session. So yeah.
Sweet. Let me put up this message here in the chat. Congratulations, Shellstronic. If you are still here in the chat, give us a hi, screenshot this, and then go raise a ticket. You are eligible for a swag drop. We just wait for a couple of seconds to see if Shellstronic is still here, or we might have to pick another winner.
Okay. So
Cool.
is that also the rule of the program of the
Yes,
swag drop?
yes, yes. It's mostly identifying folks who have been active and then giving them some additional token of love for being active.
Okay.
I am
So if he
afraid.
misses this one, it goes to other person, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I am afraid we don't have Shellstronic here. Everybody in the chat congratulating Shellstronic, calling
He's here.
Shellstronic out. Yay, you're here. Let me just pin the message again. This is your message. Go screenshot, send it on a ticket on the Discord server, and you're eligible now for a swag drop. Cool. That was one last thing I had to put you on spot for. I'm really sorry I made you do that. But I hope you had fun talking to everybody here on the stream. Any last parting thoughts you'd want to give them, which is probably some general things, some things about open source, or some insights on how they should be utilizing global events such as Global Hack Week, where they have thousands of folks coming together. What do you think they should be doing? Any insights or suggestions there?
So I think the best way to learn as a college student or anyone who is getting into the ecosystem is hackathons, and I'm glad that MLH does that because it is meant for that. So what you should really do is, even though it's not about just coming as a first prize winner, it's not about that. Hackathons always provide a space to explore, network with different people. And in my past also, I met some best people during hackathons. And I didn't actually code back then in hackathons. I was just networking with people. So that doesn't mean that it's code. It just worked for me. So just put your best, communicate. I think, you know treat it as a teamwork in a corporate company, like you're trying to achieve some goal and you're all working together. Build some skills, and there's always something best that comes out of it. And it might not reflect all of a sudden, or not in 24 hours. Maybe the something you learned today might be helpful in next few weeks or next few years. So you know that's very important that you keep learning it and keep implementing it. And always don't get afraid to implement something new, right? So don't uh, really get afraid by seeing some new stuff. So implement and do as you learn, right? So you can implement anything on the go because of the resources we have these days. I think before the internet, they were scrolling the books and searching for the content in the books. But right now you have the community, you have the answers, you have everything on the internet. So you can always try something new and implement on the go. So don't be afraid of something like that.
Couldn't have said it any better myself. Thank you so much, Joshua, once again for joining us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for sticking around for such a session. I hope all of you are taking back some bit of knowledge about open source and some bit of interest to go ahead and start talking about open source and start contributing to open source. Thank you so much for joining us. As Joshua already mentioned during the start of his talk, we had Joshua join us for the State of Developer Education podcast by MLH, where John, one of our co founders, had interviewed him. We have many more amazing folks that John has been speaking to. You can go watch all of that on this link. I will share the link on the chat. Let me see if I can find that. I just figured out that Twitch doesn't allow you to copy paste from the. Okay, let me quickly get that and then we will wrap this up. Any parting thoughts from anybody in the audience? Anything that you would want to tell us? Anything that you felt we might also have covered? Let us know. This is your time to tell us how we can have a better Global Hack Week next time. Cool. I think I have the link with me now. Yes, let me drop that on the chat. Someone saying, I walk away with knowledge in all sessions, hoping to add swag drop too. So you get that, you'll get that. I am sure we have a lot more sessions. It's just day 4. We have 3 more days to go. Go ahead and participate in all these sessions, and you definitely will get swag drops very, very soon. Cool. With that, we come to the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We will see you on a stream very, very soon. Take care. Goodbye. Bye, Joshua.